In the early months of 1908, a heavy stillness hung over the farmland just outside LaPorte, Indiana. That stillness shattered one cold April morning when fire ripped through a large brick farmhouse at the end of McClung Road. By dawn, the place was a gutted shell, its blackened beams clawing at a smoky sky, its heat still radiating into the damp earth. Locals, who had long known the widow who lived there, stood at a distance, speaking in uneasy whispers. What might have been dismissed as tragedy soon began to reveal something far more sinister. When investigators picked their way through the smoldering ruins, they made discoveries that would shock the nation. Beneath the churned dirt of hog pens, and in shallow limestone-lined pits, dusted with quicklime, the remains began to emerge. One set of bones, then another, then dozens. Over 40 victims in total, every one of them dismembered arms and legs, neatly removed. Skulls crushed or severed, signs of a hand both practiced and purposeful. These men had not wandered here by accident. They were tradesmen, farmers, and laborers from across the Midwest, each answering a carefully worded newspaper advertisement placed by a refined, wealthy widow seeking a husband. The ad promised security, affection, and a share in a prosperous farm. Many brought their life savings to start this promised new chapter. None were ever seen alive again, and in the cooled cellar of the house, beside the blackened stone walls, lay the most puzzling find of all. 3 small bodies belonging to children believed to be the widow's own, and the headless corpse of an adult woman. That body was far too small, far too light to be Belle Gunness. None of the dead had breathed in smoke. They had died before the flames touched them. Whoever placed them there had done so deliberately. The discovery ignited questions that spread as fast as the first newsmen arriving by train. Had Belle died in the fire, or had she staged her own death, leaving behind a decoy and vanishing into the world with her fortune? This was no crime of passion, no sudden break in a quiet life. It was the collapse of a long-running scheme, one built on charm, deception, and ruthlessly efficient murder. The story of what came to be known as America's murder farm was just beginning, and the most chilling revelations were still to come. By the turn of the century, LaPorte, Indiana was a place where reputation mattered, where tidy appearances and steadfast industry built the scaffolding of trust. North of the courthouse square, down the long, rutted stretch of McClung Road, stood a farm that locals pointed to as an emblem of those values. 42 acres under neat fence lines, hogs fattening in well-kept pens, a brick farmhouse whose white walls and green shutters gleamed against spring grass. The woman at its helm, Belle Gunness, carried herself with the confidence of someone who had weathered hardship and emerged stronger. Twice widowed, raising 3 children, she ran her farm with a sharp mind for profit and an unfailing air of self-possession to the people of LaPorte. Belle was the sort of figure a community admired, resilient, frugal yet not miserly, shrewd in her dealings at the market, and punctual in settling accounts at the bank. It was common knowledge that she had collected insurance when her first husband died in Chicago, and again when her second, Peter Gunness, met a bizarre end only months after their wedding. But in a farming community, death was an accepted risk. Accidents happened, and no one pressed the matter in public. Still, those who looked closely sometimes noticed shadows. School teachers remarked on how Belle's children kept to themselves, rarely joining in games, never inviting friends over. A hired man might comment in a low voice over a beer at the tavern on the sharp, chemical bite of the air drifting up from the basement some evenings. Some neighbors, recalling later, remembered that from time to time strangers arrived, men of solid build, Norwegian-speaking, dressed well enough to suggest prosperity. They would be seen at Belle's table at supper, perhaps out near the barn after dusk, and then, not at all, the true nature of McClung Road's most prosperous farm began to come to light in the last days of April 1908, on the night of the 27th. Belle's lodger, Joe Maxon, was given an evening off, and returned late to his attic room above the kitchen. Before dawn, he woke to the heavy reek of smoke and the glare of unnatural light pushing through the floorboards. He opened his door, felt the heat slap him, and heard the wood below crack under the strain. The fire was racing faster than any barn blaze he had seen, fast enough to make the glass in the windows sag and pool before a man could fetch water. Coughing, eyes streaming, Maxon snatched the small pouch of savings he kept under his mattress and clambered out the window onto the kitchen roof. The shingles beneath his bare feet were already hot. He dropped to the yard, rolled, and ran, the roar of the fire swelling behind him. By the time he reached the first cluster of houses at the edge of town, LaPorte's northern sky glowed orange. The volunteer fire crew arrived in time to save the barn, but the house was nothing more than 2 chimneys and a heap of embers. Sheriff Albert Smutzer was on hand as soon as it was safe to approach, expecting to find 4 bodies overcome by smoke in their sleep. What he found instead, in the northeast corner of the cellar, was something that would send shivers beyond county lines. 3 of the bodies belonged to children Myrtle, Lucy, and little Philip, burned but recognizable. The 4th was an adult woman. She had no head. Her frame was markedly smaller than Belle's, and the cut at the neck was sharp, clean, and without the tearing fire makes. None of the 4 had soot in their lungs. They had been dead before the blaze ever reached them. By midday, as rumors rolled through the stores and along the sidewalks, the sheriff was already listening to a story that narrowed his eyes. A stranger from South Dakota had arrived on the early train, a tall Norwegian named Assel Helgelian. He carried a bundle of letters and an edge of suspicion sharpened over months. His brother Andrew, he said, had come here in January to wed Belle Gunness. He had brought with him every cent he owned. He had not been heard from since. Those letters he carried mapped a correspondence that began in courteous generalities praise for Andrew's hard work and property. Mentions of Belle's own farmland grew into urgent requests to come quickly, to bring all your ready cash for investment, to imagine the life they could build under the same roof. The final notes, sweet and pressing, closed with phrases Assel would recount more than once. Come prepared to stay forever. The sheriff looked from the headless body on the cellar floor to the anxious man with the packet of letters. By nightfall, he had sent 4 more men to bring spades to McClung Road, and the attention of LaPorte turned from a fire to whatever lay beneath that farm's thin skin of earth. The digging began in the early morning light, a procession of boots and iron shovels, scuffing through the wet spring soil behind the ruins. Sheriff Smutzer's men took their cue from Joe Maxon, who pointed toward the hog pens first. He told them this was where Belle had often ordered him to fill pits, claiming they were garbage holes, and to tamp the earth flat when he was done. The pens reeked as hog pens always did, but beneath the animal musk was something that coaxed a wrinkling of every nose, a sweet, cloying odor that didn't belong. 3 feet down, a shovel struck something solid. The men pried it up, revealing a burlap bundle mottled with damp and lime powder. When they unfolded the sack, the stench burst out in a wave so thick that even the most seasoned farmer gagged. Inside were human remains, not whole, but arranged like pieces of butchered livestock. The severed hands were wrapped together in rags, feet bound in twine, and the head was missing entirely. Cuts at the joints were clean, avoiding the bone wherever possible. Assel Helgelian was called over. His face, already drawn tight from worry, crumpled when he recognized the gold tooth glinting in the slackened jaw of the exposed skull, and beside one arm bone, the silver watch he had given his brother. There was no need for further identification. The miner's-sized man from Dakota sank to his knees in the wet dirt, grief breaking over him as the onlookers turned away. That first bundle was only the beginning. The sheriff marked the ground for further digging, and soon another depression yielded its own grisly package, then another. By late afternoon, 5 bodies had been brought up, all male, all dismembered with the same care. None had personal effects, except for those the killer must have missed. Dr. Harry Pratt, summoned from Chicago for his forensic skill, crouched over the remains, and spoke the words that would echo through the case. These cuts follow anatomy. Whoever did this knew the map of the human body or that of a carcass. His meaning was obvious. Belle had lived with a butcher, and before that she had kept hogs herself. The knowledge of where to sever tendon from joint was second nature. The scene at the farm transformed. Spectators arrived by horse and wagon from neighboring towns, kneeling against fence rails to watch the men work. Local boys darted forward, pretending at bravery to catch a glimpse before deputies chased them. Off merchants sent wagons, selling coffee, pie, even lemonade, to the crowd. LaPorte, once a railroad stop, unknown to most of the country, was beginning to appear in headlines from Chicago to New York. On the third day of searching, a new shock emerged. The well long ago filled in was cleared, earth and stone tumbling out to reveal the crumpled remains of a young girl. The skull was fractured in several places, as if beaten with a blunt tool. Neighbors whispered her name before the sheriff confirmed it. Jenny Olson, Belle's foster daughter, last seen in 1906, before allegedly being sent to school in California. Here was proof she had never left the farm. Her body, unlike the men's, was intact, suggesting she may have been killed before Belle assumed the routine of butchery and burial. Jenny's reappearance and death deepened suspicions about Belle's past claims. People who had once accepted her word about visitors or relatives now found themselves replaying every unusual thing they had noticed: the quick funerals, the visitors who never returned to town, the frequent trips to the bank with thick rolls of bills. As the days passed, names began attaching to fragments unearthed in Belle's yard. A boot with a distinctive repaired heel tied one victim to Minnesota. A pocket knife marked with initials linked another to Wisconsin. In each case, the story was similar: a bachelor, some savings, an advertisement answered, and then silence. For the sheriff, this was no longer about a local widow and a fire. This was about a method, applied again and again, hidden in plain sight behind a curtain of respectability and rural isolation. By week's end, the count of retrieved bodies had risen into double digits, and the edges of the property still rippled with unturned soil. It was not just the number, but the consistency of the work that chilled the men swinging spades. Every cut was precise, avoided unnecessary sawing, and showed no hesitation. These weren't crimes of temper. They were tasks completed according to an established plan. The farm that had stood as a symbol of the American work ethic had been, for years, a quiet factory of death. The sheriff's team pressed farther out from the farmhouse ruins, their boots sinking into the damp rows of the kitchen garden, the vegetable beds now reduced to churned mud. More burlap sacks surfaced there, layered under the roots of cabbage and rhubarb, all holding the same grisly cargo. Each was dusted with quicklime, the chemical bite still sharp enough to sting eyes and throats when the wind shifted. It was a farmer's trick turned to darker purpose: lime to hurry decomposition, to keep the scent from carrying too far. By now, the rhythm was set. A man with a spade would call out when his blade hit something soft or fibrous. Deputies would kneel, ease the soil away until the edge of canvas showed. Then two men would lift the bundle onto a tarp. Dr. Pratt and his assistant would open it carefully, cataloging the condition of remains, noting the cuts, the missing parts. Almost every set lacked the head, hands, and feet, the identifiers, the features which might tether a victim to a name and history. On the periphery of the search, the onlookers' ranks swelled. Reporters scribbled in pads, telegraph runners dashed to the depot to wire dispatches to Chicago and beyond. Vendors wheeled through, selling peanuts, lemonade, and even small souvenir bricks pried from the fire's debris. The grotesque lure of the place had transformed it into a carnival of the morbid. Then came the find that reignited speculation in a shallow corner pit behind the barn. They pulled a body still clothed. The boots were of fine make, the trousers lined the coat with a stitched monogram on the inside breast pocket. That, coupled with a particular style of pocket knife, still in the garment, pointed to John Moe, of Elbow Lake, Minnesota. His brother back home had last heard from him in late 1906. In a letter brimming with optimism about his prospective bride in LaPorte, the identification tightened the emerging pattern. Moe, like the others, was a middle-aged Norwegian bachelor with no close kin nearby and a modest nest egg. Each traceable victim matched those same details. Banks in multiple states began responding to inquiries from LaPorte, their clerks, confirming large withdrawals in cash. 2 men who'd told them they were off to visit a widow in Indiana. Letters found amidst the charred debris in Belle's farmhouse underlined the method. Dozens of onion-skinned sheets, her scrawl running in a mix of plain English and Norwegian turns of phrase, all tailored to her reader. To one man she promised, "Together we will honor the Lord in our home," quoting a familiar psalm. To another, "Your shrewd mind and my good land will make a fine profit for us both." She asked each of them to bring all the money you need for our start, and to keep their coming visit our happy secret until plans are complete. Interviews with townsfolk began to surface in the LaPorte Herald. A seamstress recalled altering waistcoats for Belle's cousins, who never returned to collect them. A drayman swore he had carried multiple heavy trunks from the depot to Belle's place in the past 5 years, always for men too busy courting to tip properly. Even tradesmen who had once admired her bargaining in the market now remembered the times she paid with fresh high-denomination bills. The sheriff's problem was not proving deaths had occurred. It was placing them on Belle's hands in a way a court would respect. The killer's advantage here was in volume. Her careful selection left few who would come forward to demand an investigation. Any bachelor headed west, or back to the old country, could vanish without ripple for months, sometimes years. By the second week of excavation, the tally of bodies and partial remains had climbed into the 20s. The sheriff's men expanded the search to every outbuilding, probing with iron rods for softer earth. In the carriage house, beneath a floorboard, they found more personal effects: a gold pocket watch, a leather satchel with initials in gilt, several men's hats in sizes far larger than any local farmhand wore. These artifacts were as telling as the bones, each a ghost of a journey that had ended here. And still, in the cellar beneath those scorched walls, unanswered questions lingered. There was the headless woman's body, too small by far to be Belle's, arranged in death beside the children. Though lime and fire had done their work, the bones told of decapitation before the blaze, the precision no accident. If not Belle, then who? And if it was Belle, how did it square with the widowed farmer's broad frame and unmistakable presence that half the town could recall? The unearthed dead gave shape to her years of work, but the absence of Belle Gunness from among them remained the sharpest edge of the story, an edge that promised to cut deeper before the truth, or something like it, came to light. The third week of work on the Gunness property started under a low gray sky, the spring breeze carrying the sour reek of disturbed earth well beyond the fence lines. Deputies, no longer needing to be told where to dig, moved methodically from one suspicious depression to the next. The grim familiarity of the process did nothing to dull its impact. Each sack they raised from the muck was a fresh reminder of the scale and the organization behind what had happened here. The sheriff began keeping 2 ledgers, one for the remains themselves, cataloged by location, condition, and any distinctive marks, and another for personal effects. The effects told stories the bones could not. A worn leather billfold held 3 faded calling cards from a bank in Wisconsin. A pair of steel-rimmed spectacles still in a crushed case bore the stamp of an optician in Minnesota. A ring set with a chipped garnet matched one described in a letter from an anxious brother in Iowa. More names began to trickle into his investigation. Relatives from across the Midwest wrote or arrived in person, drawn by the newspaper accounts. Each carried some variation of the same tale. a Norwegian bachelor in his 40s or 50s, some savings in the bank, unmarried but eager to wed, answering an advert in a Norwegian language paper placed by a wealthy widow in Indiana. Each man had left home buoyed by optimism, often after liquidating assets to travel and help invest in the farm, and each had last been seen on the road to Laporte. The letters found in the ruins made the pattern explicit. In a fire-blackened trunk, they discovered carbon copies of Belle's correspondence, a habit that let her keep her stories straight between multiple men. Reading them in sequence was like watching a performance practiced to perfection. The early notes were polite inquiries about the man's farm or trade, assurances that she sought a good partner who could share in her success. The later ones grew warmer, weaving in flattery, enticements, and, most crucially, instructions to bring capital in cash. Survivors in town began to add color to the picture. A livery stable owner recalled driving a half-dozen different gentlemen callers from the train depot to Belle's farm over the past few years, always in the late afternoon. He never took any of them back. A store clerk remembered Belle buying large quantities of chloroform, explaining it was for slaughtering hogs without cruelty. The grisliest find of the week came from a patch just beyond the orchard. The digging team hit wood rather than burlap, a stout crate, its slats held with rusted nails. Inside were bones arranged strangely, as though the body had been compacted to fit. The skull was intact yet bore a deep, square-edged fracture, blunt force trauma, swift and final. The man's boots, still on the skeletal feet, had been patched with a distinctive patterned leather. A telegram to Chicago confirmed they matched the description of a missing man from that city's Norwegian district. Last seen withdrawing his entire savings before heading to meet Mrs. Gunness. By month's end, the count of recovered individuals and partial remains had reached close to 30. Dr. Pratt's ongoing examinations reinforced the conclusion that these were not crimes of sudden rage. The killer or killers had taken time, selecting victims whose disappearances would not cause noise, dispatching them with efficient violence, then dismantling and concealing the evidence with skill. And yet, the central riddle persisted, even as the sheriff compiled a roster of the dead. The living subject of his investigation was nowhere to be found except, perhaps, as a body that did not match her stature lying headless in her own cellar. The townspeople, amid their horror, argued in undertones. Had Belle perished in her own trap, or was she far from here, watching from a distance as the earth gave up her secrets, one sack at a time? The answer to that question would come to dominate every conversation, from the courthouse gossip to the columns of the nation's largest papers. By early May, the grim arithmetic of the farm had drawn not only newspapermen and gawkers, but experts, from larger cities' detectives, forensic specialists, and even private agents hired by desperate families. Laporte, with its orderly streets and trim storefronts, now hosted hitching posts crowded with strange teams and hotel registers swollen with unfamiliar names. The Gunness farm, guarded by deputies, had become the county's unwilling stage, and the play unfolding there was nothing less than a national sensation. It was during this phase that the scope of Belle's operation began to crystallize. The steady stream of arrivals from out of town carried their own fragments of the same puzzle. Inquiries came from Minnesota, the Dakotas, Wisconsin, Kansas, each letter or testimony identifying a man who matched the now familiar mold: Norwegian heritage, solitary, middle-aged, financially stable, but unencumbered by close kin nearby. Each had left home on the promise of marriage to a well-to-do widow in Indiana, often after being told in her letters to bring all the money you can spare, so we may begin our new life without delay. The precision of her victim selection impressed even hardened investigators. She seemed to have understood, instinctively or by experience, the vulnerabilities of her hunting ground. The men she lured were unlikely to prompt rapid inquiries. When questions did come, months later, the trail was cold and explanations emigration back to Norway. A move west for work were plausible enough to end the matter. More remains were uncovered from beneath the tilled rows, where spring planting should have been underway. One contained a residual scrap of oilcloth in which the corpse had been wrapped, perhaps to slow the seep of decomposition into the soil. Another was identified, by dental work done in Chicago, as belonging to a man named Olaf Svenhor. His disappearance in 1907 had puzzled acquaintances. They now learned he had told friends he was headed east to inspect some land with a prospective bride. From the charred remnants upstairs in the farmhouse, investigators sifted other damning details. A twisted metal cash box, empty but still bearing scorch marks from the fire, lay in what had been Belle's private room. Nearby, the warped frame of what might have been a hidden compartment in her wardrobe suggested she had kept ready access. 2 valuables, easily removed in haste. Then came a small discovery that shifted the investigation's momentum: an envelope of photographs, miraculously spared from total ruin by being wedged inside a wall cavity. They depicted various men, some older, some stout, all dressed formally, in studio portraits common for the time. Each bore on the back, in Belle's hand, the man's first name and sometimes a location: Sioux Falls, St. Paul, Minneapolis. Cross-referencing these with existing missing person inquiries began to stitch separate tragedies into a single, sprawling case. Public pressure mounted for an arrest, and the sheriff turned his focus toward Ray Lamfer, Belle's on-and hired hand. Lamfer had been let go earlier that year under acrimonious circumstances and had reportedly made dark remarks about Belle to anyone who would listen. More damning was the discovery in his possession of items linked to known victims: a overcoat belonging to John Moe, a gold watch chain confirmed as Andrew Helglian's. Lamfer's interrogations yielded little consistency. Some days he denied even being near the farm on the night of the fire. Other days he admitted seeing the flames but claimed indifference. At one point he suggested Belle was too smart to be caught and that she'd know how to vanish if she wanted to. Theories began to drift through LaPorte like wood smoke. That Belle, sensing impending discovery, had staged her own death by planting the headless body of another woman. Or alternatively, that she had been attacked, her crimes interrupted. For every voice certain she was dead, another was sure she was simply elsewhere. Perhaps reading about herself in the Chicago Tribune over morning coffee, as the shovels bit into yet another stretch of earth near the orchard and pulled up the 12th body of the dig. The question loomed larger. In a farmyard yielding so many of her victims, why could no one prove Belle Gunness had joined them? Or was she, even now, planning where to dig next? By mid-May, the farm had yielded so many bodies that even the most seasoned diggers in Sheriff Smutzer's crew fell into silent, mechanical rhythms, swinging their spades without comment. Each day brought fresh recoveries, bundles wrapped in rotting burlap, skeletal fragments with teeth still clenched, the curve of a boot sole emerging from earth gone soft with rain. The lime-bleached soil clung to everything, caking gloves and boots, leaving a dry sting in the nose that mingled with the sweet-sick odor of decay. The list of names and possible identifications on the sheriff's desk grew with each telegram. Some were confirmed by specific items: a unique ring, a watch engraved with initials, a hatband woven with a Scandinavian pattern known in one particular Minnesota district. Others were no more than well-founded suspicions. The timing of a man's disappearance, the last letter he sent, the amount of money withdrawn before traveling to Indiana. Every one of them fit the outline that had become unmistakable. The newspapers seized on the details, feeding a public appetite that seemed insatiable. Headlines blared numbers: 11 bodies found, count now 22, Gunness, farm an open graveyard. Reporters embroidered the accounts with lurid speculation on Belle's methods, her physical strength, her cunning. Some painted her as a monstrous aberration of womanhood. Others cast her as a shrewd businesswoman whose product was death from the rubble of the house. Investigators continued to salvage small but telling artifacts. One scorched ledger, its corners charred but much of the writing legible, contained entries noting dates alongside terse codes initials, sums of money, and brief phrases like arrived, settled, or, chillingly, cleared. The pattern of those codes aligned almost perfectly with known arrivals of her suitors, and shortly thereafter, with the suspected dates of their deaths. Neighbors, emboldened by the weight of public condemnation, began to share details they had kept to themselves for years. A farm wife from down the road recalled Belle borrowing her largest washtub late one night and returning it the next morning scrubbed so clean it seemed new. A boy who had trapped rabbits near the property spoke of seeing deep, fresh holes one week, then flat, tamped earth the next. A grocer remembered Belle making large purchases of lye and insisting on paying in cash. Ray Lamfer's name appeared more often in conversation and in print. His bitterness, after being dismissed from Belle's employ, was widely known, as were the threats he was said to have muttered in town. The discovery of victims' belongings in his room tied him, at least circumstantially, to the crimes. But those who knew him well wondered aloud if he were capable of such a calculating enterprise, or if he were merely a convenient scapegoat. For whatever had become of Belle, the deeper question whether Belle was dead or alive shadowed every aspect of the case. The headless body in the basement remained the only candidate for her remains, but its size and build conflicted with the recollections of half the county. State authorities brought in outside medical experts, who agreed only that the woman had died before the fire, and that her head had been removed with practiced skill. They could not, from the charred bones, give any definitive identification. Meanwhile, families kept arriving by train, descending on the sheriff's office with their own photographs, trinkets, and stories. Some made the grim journey out to the farm, scanning the piles of recovered clothing and scraps of belongings laid out under a makeshift canvas awning. The emotional cost was evident. Matches brought tears, while the absence of recognition brought an odd, guilty relief. In either case, the certainty of what had happened on McClung Road was settling into the bones of the community. By the third week in May, the official tally of human remains recovered, whether whole bodies or partial skeletons, approached 40. The search had scoured nearly every inch of Belle's land. Yet still, there were patches of turned soil that whispered to the imagination. The scale of the murders was almost beyond comprehension for a rural county accustomed to the occasional barroom fight or land dispute gone violent. And through it all, the woman around whom the whole grim machinery had turned was absent, perhaps reduced to ash, perhaps just beyond the horizon, reinventing herself in some boarding house or small town where the papers spoke little of Indiana. On those possibilities hung the tension that kept the national press in LaPorte and the townspeople gathered at the rail fence, as if the next bundle lifted from the ground might hold the answer everyone craved. By late May, the Gunness property had become less a farm than an open-air excavation site, its once orderly fields scored with trenches and pockmarked with fresh mounds of turned soil. Deputies with sunburned necks and blistered palms worked in coordinated teams, watched by a gallery of townsfolk, journalists, and the simply curious who leaned on fence rails as if attending some grim theater. The rhythm was constant. Dig, strike something solid, ease a burlap-wrapped bundle from the ground, unroll it under the watch of Dr. Pratt and his assistants, then tag and cart it away. The facts emerging from the methodical unearthing had moved past the point of anyone's disbelief. What was taking shape was a kind of ledger, not written in ink and paper, but in skulls, bones, and the personal tokens left behind. A shoe button here, a pocket watch there, each one tethered to the memory of a man who had left home to marry the wealthy widow in LaPorte. The sheriff's desk in town grew crowded with letters from all points west and north. Wives, siblings, cousins, and lifelong friends wrote in longhand of men they'd known, quoting the last lines received. Asterisk, I have met a fine woman who owns a great farm. She has asked me to come quickly, and to bring means for improvements. Asterisk. Bankers from Minnesota to the Dakotas confirmed quiet withdrawals of life savings, often in cash, just before the men vanished. From the wreckage of Belle's house continued to come new evidence, each piece darkening the already foul picture. One scorched envelope, found wedged behind a beam, contained a thin gold wedding band and a folded note simply marked to be sized. A warped biscuit tin once filled with buttons and small coins was discovered in a compartment beneath the bedroom floor. Wedged beside it, the remains of a lady's handbag stuffed with bank receipts. Witness accounts from LaPorte. Residents grew bolder the more these discoveries filled the papers. A milk delivery boy recalled seeing unfamiliar men on Belle's porch in the evenings, laughing and smoking, only for Belle to tell him the next morning that her relatives had departed suddenly at first light. A hardware merchant remembered her purchasing a new meat cleaver and several large lye tins in one visit, a transaction that struck him only now, in hindsight, as ominous. And then, among the possessions brought up from under the hog pen, came a particularly chilling find. A child's small shoe, far too tiny for any of Belle's children in recent years. No matching remains were found nearby, leaving investigators to wonder if there were still graves on the property no spade had yet reached, or if older killings had been carried out before Belle perfected the disposal method now so consistently revealed in grave after grave. Ray Lampher's name remained in heavy rotation in every conversation about the case. His history with Belle was complicated. Hired man, rumored lover, possibly a confidant to parts of her operation. The local prosecutor began to float the theory that Lampher, in a jealous rage or for gain, had set the fire that ended the Gunness household. But others, locals and some reporters, nurtured the suspicion that Belle herself had orchestrated her own disappearance, leaving behind that too small headless body to confound the law while she vanished with whatever wealth she had squeezed from her procession of suitors. Each new discovery on McClung Road further blurred the line between those two theories. The count of recovered victims now nudged above 40, their deaths stretching back years. Some had been poisoned, others struck down with crushing blows. All bore the signs of careful dismemberment. It was scale and precision, more than anything, that unsettled even the most experienced men in the sheriff's ranks. It suggested planning, patience, and an utter absence of conscience, qualities that, in Belle Gunness, seemed every bit as cultivated as the vegetable rows and hogs that had hidden her crimes for so long. The presses kept running out of Chicago, St. Paul, and Milwaukee. Each new edition carried the tally higher, splashed with the kind of details that kept the case alive, from butcher's shop counter to banker's desk. And somewhere beyond LaPorte's borders, if the more persistent whispers were to be believed, the woman at the center of it all might still have been watching. The map of her past horrors unrolling daily in the headlines. Her name etched now not in the language of courtship, but in the annals of American murder. As June settled over LaPorte County, the search at the Gunness farm became both more exhaustive and more desperate. Every visible patch of disturbed soil had been dug, every outbuilding floor pried up, every trough and feeding pit probed with long iron rods. Still, deputies found reasons to keep their shovels moving, not just to widen the tally of the dead, but in the lingering hope of unearthing something that could settle the central question: was Belle among them, or had she walked away from the conflagration she sparked? More evidence of method continued to surface. In a shallow trench just beyond the orchard fence, a team uncovered 2 burlap bundles stacked together, separated by a layer of flat stones. The arrangement suggested these killings were not hurried or clumsy. Whoever buried them had made room for more, as if thinking ahead. Inside the top bundle lay the remains of a man in workman's trousers, the cloth still faintly bearing the stamp of a clothier in Sioux Falls. In the other, a slightly built man with a healed break in his arm. A letter from a worried sister. in Iowa described her missing brother as slight of frame, with an arm once broken in a timberyard accident. Dr. Pratt's examinations kept highlighting the same details. Blows to the head or neck, delivered with precision. Consistent dismemberment at the joints. Absence of defensive wounds suggesting the victims had been incapacitated first, likely drugged. The idea was reinforced when a small time-worn medicine tin, embossed with chloral hydrate, was found among the fire debris. Its cap was rusted tight, but the residue inside still carried the unmistakable chemical scent from the ashes of the main house. Another cache of correspondence came to light, letters Belle had clearly never sent. These drafts, written in her distinctive, slightly awkward script, were chilling in their uniformity. Each began with polite interest, moved quickly to admiration or fondness, and closed with some variation of, "Bring what money you can." So, we start unencumbered. 4 men she'd written to more than once. There were carefully tailored phrases, a scripture verse for the devout, a joke about harvest yields for the farmer, a reference to our Norwegian ways for the homesick immigrant. Around town, the case bent daily life into something almost unrecognizable. Church suppers became discussion forums. The postmaster, long familiar with Belle's steady traffic in letters, told of the sizable envelopes she mailed, often with multiple stamps to cover their weight. The telegraph office near the depot reported regular wires sent to names that now matched the growing list of the dead. Even the blacksmith spoke of sharpening tools for her, heavy enough to fell more than livestock. The prosecutor, facing mounting public demand for a resolution, began to shape the case against Ray Lampfer more aggressively. Witnesses were lined up to claim they'd heard his bitter threats after being dismissed from Belle's service. Others swore they'd seen him near the property the night of the fire. In Lampfer's rented room, lawmen had found personal items from at least 2 of the identified victims, trophies or payments, depending on which theory one believed. Yet, for all the circumstantial weight the case carried, the void where Belle's living or unquestionably dead body should have been left it teetering. Without her, the motive for arson looked different. Without her, the possibility remained alive and tantalizing to the papers that she was still out there, reading the same reports, counting the same recovered victims, and perhaps already setting down roots somewhere new under another name. By the middle of the month, with more than 40 remains unearthed and a web of correspondence linking many of them to the woman of McClung Road, it was impossible to deny the scale of what had been done here. But the absence of a single decisive discovery, the one that would tell them where Belle Gunness's story had truly ended, kept lawmen digging, and kept Lawport in the grip of both horror and a strange kind of suspense. Through the latter half of June, the Gunness farm had been stripped nearly bare of its secrets, at least the ones shallow enough to reach. Every new pit opened by the sheriff's team seemed to yield some fragment of the same macabre story. Another burlap-wrapped parcel, another careful arrangement of bones, another name from a letter or keepsake that matched the growing roster of men who had stepped onto McClung Road never to leave. Yet the grim work continued, fueled by equal parts procedure and morbid hope that some last buried corner would reveal something conclusive about Belle herself. The orchard, once a pleasant buffer between the farmyard bustle and the road, became the latest focus. Beneath the gnarled shadow of apple trees, deputies dug into soil dark with years of leaf rot and found 3 more bundles, each stacked neatly over the other. The topmost contained the partial remains of a man still wearing the remnants of suspenders. The middle, a taller individual, his boots water-damaged but intact. The lowest, so decomposed that only buttons and scraps of cloth clung to what bones remained. The arrangement, the orderliness code, the other clustered grave, found weeks before, and spoke of an unnerving practicality. Belle had buried in batches, maximizing her space, minimizing her labor. The forensic examinations revealed familiar patterns: lethally efficient blows to the skull, or deep cleaver cuts to the back of the neck, joints severed with practiced ease, evidence of premortem sedation in some cases. The tools required for such consistent work had not been found amid the charred ruins, leading to whispered speculation that Belle either removed them before the fire or left them with an accomplice. More testimony from townspeople trickled in, the sort of details that once seemed too small to mention but now shone with sinister clarity. A drayman remembered hauling several large crates from the station too. Belle's farm crates so heavy it took 2 men to pivot them through the farmhouse door. A dry goods clerk admitted to selling her an unusually large quantity of men's socks and undergarments over several months, always paid for in cash. A farmhand from another property swore he had seen Belle late at night, alone in the yard, tamping down earth with the flat of a shovel. The pile of personal effects at the sheriff's office expanded: daily rings, watches, eyeglasses, billfolds, bits of clothing each tagged with the date and place of recovery. Families arriving in LaPorte would sometimes recognize an object instantly, their faces tightening with a mixture of grief and grim satisfaction at having, at least, an answer. Others pawed through the display in agonized silence, leaving with nothing more than the knowledge that their missing kin might still be one of the unclaimed dead. Ray Lampher, seated in the county jail, could not avoid the rising tide of implication, though he continued to offer muddled, contradictory statements, some denying any role, others hinting at inside knowledge. Prosecutors seized on his possession of certain victim-linked items. Each new body found was another rhetorical brick in the case they were building, even as the defense prepared to argue that his guilt or innocence in the fire could not explain the years of killings that had preceded it. By this point, the property itself seemed exhausted of simple answers. Investigators expanded their search outward, checking fence lines, drainage ditches, and the shallow banks of nearby creeks. Dogs were walked through adjacent fields, sniffing for traces long faded. All the while, the headless corpse from the cellar loomed as both evidence and riddle, too small and too light to fit the descriptions of Belle, yet treated with the same care and arrangement as her children beside it. There was a mounting sense, among those working and watching, that the central figure of the whole affair was slipping permanently into the realm of speculation. If Belle had been among the dead, she would have been the only one whose identity couldn't be confirmed. If she hadn't, then somewhere beyond LaPorte's dusty streets, she was very much alive, remade, renamed, and likely plotting whatever version of her profitable enterprise the times and her circumstances allowed. That question, the one no amount of digging seemed able to answer, kept each new day on McClung Road taut with both dread and anticipation. By early July, the earth at McClung Road had been turned so many times it scarcely resembled farmland. Pits yawned where vegetables once grew. Fence lines sagged from the constant leaning of gawkers, and the air carried not the scent of hogs and feed, but the heavy, unmistakable undertone of disturbed graves. The crews had slowed, not from reluctance but from thoroughness prodding deeper, sifting smaller clods through screens in case a misplaced ring or button might offer one more link between a bundle of bones and a family waiting for closure. The human toll of the investigation was evident in town. Men on the sheriff's crew worked in near silence, faces drawn from the repetition of the grim task. Dr. Pratt and his assistants labored over their makeshift tables, measuring, noting, and reassembling what could be reassembled. Each new examination reaffirmed the same themes: careful incapacitation by poison or drug, lethal strikes to the skull or neck, methodical dismemberment, burial in places chosen for convenience rather than sentiment. The coroner's inquest into the headless woman's body from the cellar had stalled into frustration. Measurements and bone structure stubbornly contradicted the recorded size and weight of Belle Gunness. Dental comparison was impossible, given the absence of the skull. Clothing remnants provided no conclusive ties. And yet, for some, it remained simpler to believe that Belle had perished in her own fire than to accept she might still be walking free. Her crimes narrated daily by the presses, as if she were reading along. In town, the flow of visitors strained the modest hotels and boarding houses. Families came clutching photographs, letters, and in some cases the last tokens sent by a man they loved to watch fob. A book, a postcard depicting Laporte. They crowded the sheriff's office, bending over the growing collection of tagged evidence. Joy was rare. More often there were tears, or the stiff-faced acceptance of a truth come too late to change. The newspapers printed each development as drama, the growing count of bodies, the smallest rumor of Belle's possible sightings, the conflicting portraits of her from those who thought they knew her. Some painted her as a master manipulator with the charm to melt suspicion, others as a blunt, physically imposing woman who relied on brute force and opportunity. Both portraits seemed to fit. The facts showed a woman who had tailored herself to her prey, writing letters in the tones they wanted to hear, serving meals that evoked home, luring them into a place prepared for their end. Ray Lamper's preliminary hearings dredged up equal measures of accusation and uncertainty. Witnesses claimed to have seen him near the property the night of the fire. Others swore Belle had confided in him, making him privy to her business. In his cell he entertained both postures, denying involvement one day, insinuating intimate knowledge of the killings the next. For the prosecutor, the inconsistency was a problem. For the reporters, it was gold. By mid-July, the ground yielded fewer finds, but the sense of unfinished business only grew. Every pause in discovery felt like a prelude to one last, decisive unearthing, something that might close the gap in the story where Belle's fate should be. Instead, each day ended much like the last. Tagged remains taken to the coroner, items laid out for identification, the crowd drifting away at dusk, and over it all lingered the same uneasy calculation. The number of confirmed dead would likely never match the number who lay undiscovered, and the woman whose farm had become synonymous with death might already be far distant, carrying a name no one in Laporte would recognize if they heard it. The property was surrendering its secrets, piece by piece, but the one its diggers most wanted still lay out of reach. If the dark legacy of Belle Gunness and her murder farm has gripped you, share this story with someone who can stomach the most unsettling corners of true crime. Support Unseen Anthology by liking this video. It tells us you want more of America's buried horrors. Subscribe and ring the notification bell so you won't miss the next investigation into history's killers and con artists. What do you think really happened to Belle? Did she perish in the fire?